Thanks, Michelle. Everyone hear me okay? The title in the abstract book is much more long-winded than that. I chose to just cut it down. So basically what we're going to talk about today is developing frameworks and populating those frameworks to inform biodiversity conservation under climate change, essentially. So what climate adaptation strategies are relevant in what areas and under what situations. I acknowledge my co-authors, Linda from the Australian National Herbarium now, and Cyro, and Andrew West from the Adelaide Monastery Ranges Natural Resources region in Juna, who's going to be speaking about some similar stuff in the next talk as well, at a much more detailed level. So traditionally in the climate change adaptation literature around biodiversity conservation, there's essentially two schools of thought. One is that we just keep doing what we're doing, but we just do it harder. So all those traditional activities like revegetation, restoration, pest plant animal management, all of those things that we're really good at and we do a lot of, we just keep doing those things. And what climate change has done in that situation has just made us place much stronger emphasis on getting that stuff done better. And the key there is it's a perfectly legitimate way of going in some situations, because the key is what that's about is really about building more resilience into those systems and more adaptive capacity, as Peter put it, into those systems, so that those systems are able to cope with whatever change comes, given the uncertainty around climate change in particular. The other school of thought is, as best exemplified by our friend the panic monster here, is pretty much chuck everything historic out the window. The world is going to change so much that we're just going to have to completely rethink how we do biodiversity conservation in Australia. And the response to that can either be panic or really have a hard think about what do we want the future to look like, and what does biodiversity conservation as a paradigm look like under those future scenarios. Both of those schools of thought, keep doing what you're doing, panic, are both perfectly legitimate responses in certain situations, but they're unlikely to be universally true or universally useful everywhere you look. And the reason is because climate change isn't acting homogeneously across the entire globe, entire nation, or even regions. So globally, you've got areas such as the Palearctic up here, which are going to change a lot. Massive climate change occurring up in those systems. And so we really have to think much harder about what the impact of climate change is, say, compared to Central Asia or parts of Central Western Australia. So the sensitivity of biodiversity to climate change isn't going to be the same everywhere. The other thing to consider is that climate change isn't acting on biodiversity globally in isolation of all those other drivers which are impacting on biodiversity that we already know about. Things like land clearance, intensification of agriculture, pest plants and animals, the movements of plants and animals around the world. All those things are still impacting on biodiversity in different ways, and they're often impacting on biodiversity in ways that will be exacerbated by climate change. So we have to consider that as part of the story as well. And as this map shows, the impacts, other human impacts, also are homogenous across the globe. So we've got really intensively impacted areas like the Indian subcontinent and southeastern Australia, for example, and less intensively modified systems. So we can't necessarily expect that those two situations I talked about are going to apply the same way everywhere when we're designing our adaptation strategies for biodiversity. So a bunch of clever people have come up with some frameworks to help frame the types of different strategic response to climate change that we might think about when we're thinking about biodiversity conservation. And it basically takes those two pieces of information, the exposure to future climate, so how sensitive are biodiversity likely to be to a changing climate, no matter how large that climate change is. And that's driven by things like how close to the coast is it, what latitude is it in, how much topographic diversity does it have, because that helps to buffer the impacts of climate change at local scales. But it also takes into account those other factors, such as the level of fragmentation, the level of native vegetation that remains, the level of impact of those other human, the level of impact of those other human impacts has had as well. And that really drives that adaptive capacity that Peter was talking about. So no matter what's on this axis, if a system has very low resilience to change, it's not going to take much to tip that over into a new state, into a transformed state. And so we really have to take both of those factors into account. And it really has an impact both on how we assess those systems, but also what our strategic response to that assessment is. So if you've got systems that are both have low exposure to future climate, so low sensitivity to climate change, and they're also relatively intact, so they're functioning really well as systems, high native veg cover, those sorts of things, then really our climate response may well just be maintain them in their current state and just keep an eye on them. Make sure that you're able to address any emerging issues that come along the way. The other side of the coin is that if you've got systems that have highly exposed to climate change, so they're likely to go rapid turnover, and they're already sitting on the edge, so they're already teetering on low resilience, then that's really where we have to collectively start having a really tough conversation about the past being much less of a template by which we can operate, and we really have to start thinking about that more transformational change, which is the tricky conversation that we really need to start having. But the point of these sort of frameworks is we don't necessarily have to have those tricky conversations everywhere we look. So it's just an example, and Andrew will go into this in much more detail in his presentation, but we kind of understand that there's some variation in the level of adaptive capacity across these different systems in the melty ranges, through the uplands, which have relatively high resilience, down to places like the lower slopes, which have low resilience, and the northern plains, which are in fact have high resilience, but they're in a degraded state. So the only things that are left there is highly resilient species. The cockroaches are all that's left up there. Sorry to anyone who lives up there. So when you couple that together with what we think we know about the relative sensitivity to climate change, and you can start developing very different strategies in those different systems. So the uplands, again, it's mostly about maintaining those systems, ensure you're addressing those emerging issues. Whereas places like the coast, while there's a high level of native veg along that coastal system, because it's so highly sensitive to small changes in climate, particularly through sea level rise, then we really have to start considering what our transformational options are in that part of the world. But again, Andrew will go into that sort of stuff in more detail. So the work that we did around this was at a much broader scale. We applied it at a much coarser scale in terms of larger landscapes. And it was part of this Stream 2 funding out of the Regional NRM Planning and Climate Change Fund, the previous Commonwealth Government handed out to support NRM regions to ensure that their NRM planning was climate ready. Louise talked about this a bit in the climate change session this morning at a national level. For the purposes of this, we did some work for this Murray Basin cluster, which included the SAMDB and South East regions, but also included a whole bunch of CMAs and local land service regions in New South Wales and Victoria. And we assessed the resilience fairly coarsely, just through a model vegetation condition layer that Office of Environment and Heritage in New South Wales helped develop. And it's pretty much a proxy for native veg cover, essentially, which in turn is a pretty coarse proxy for resilience. It's got a whole bunch of hairs on it, but at this sort of level, it's probably got adequate information to at least have a go at what we think the relative resilience of landscape scale biodiversity is across those landscapes. We assessed the sensitivity of flora to sensitivity of biodiversity to climate change using some vegetation turnover models that CSIRO and Bureau of Meteorology did at the national level. And it pretty much makes sense, again, at this really coarse scale. The detail is probably missing because of the scale of the modelling, but certainly this coarse scale, the closer you are to the coast, you'll likely be less sensitive to climate change. These upland regions, which have that topographic diversity built in, less sensitive to climate change. Then sort of those big mallee belts, those big sheep wheat belts that are relatively flat and often occur in those ecological transition zones between, say, the mallee and the grassy woodlands, where you're likely to get much higher turnover under smaller climate change scenarios. So bringing that information together at landscape scale, and you get something like this, which is kind of a semi-quantitative version of that sort of rainbow diagram I showed you before, where you've got landscapes up here, which are both have relatively high resilience, so they're relatively intact, and on that sort of measure of climate sensitivity based on that plant compositional turnover, the turnover is relatively low up here than it is, say, over here on this side of the coin. Whereas down here you've got a bunch of landscapes which both are more sensitive to climate change as predicted by those models, but also have relatively low resilience, so their veg cover is fairly low. And that's the sort of block of landscapes that regional NRM and others are going to have to start thinking about what do we actually want these systems to be in the future. Just some examples there, you've got the inland slopes, which is some of western New South Wales slopes, the sort of drier grassy woodland country, which again, is that transition zone. It's been intensively modified for agriculture versus places like the Grampians and a lot of the alpine country, which is topographically diverse, poor for agriculture historically, so it hasn't had those same level of impacts as some of those other more agricultural systems. And you can start mapping some of those things out, and you can sort of see patterns here where, again, that broad sort of wheat sheep belt through the middle has had large impacts and is in that sort of transition zone where you're going to get high changes in response to climate change, versus some of the more alpine areas which seem to be much more better buffered, both in terms of their climatic buffering but also in terms of their biological resilience in those systems. So you can start mapping that stuff out, start asking some of those questions in response to these conceptual frameworks where do we actually start having to have those tough conversations around transformational change from a biodiversity perspective, and where can we probably worry about it less and less immediately. So I guess my last slide is really just to talk about the fact that we did that sort of analysis across that fairly large region. It was a really coarse analysis. So, the regions can take what they want out of that as a first cut, if you like. But really the key message that we wanted to get through to those regions was not so much the information, but it was the conceptual framework that we sort of helped to develop to help them start thinking about adaptation and just highlight the fact that your adaptation responses are going to be really strongly dependent on the climate context you're working in, but also on the current the adaptive capacity of the systems you're working in. So what sort of land use context are you working in? What's the current state of your biodiversity that you're working with? Those things are really important things to consider when you start thinking about your adaptation strategies, and you shouldn't probably just automatically default to panic or do nothing without having a really strong think about what context you happen to be working in. The other thing to think about is that the analyses I've been presenting today, and most of the thinking I've been presenting today, is at a sort of coarse landscape scale. And while that gives you some information at a coarse scale, you need to start thinking about the biodiversity that sits within those landscapes at finer scales. So while the Southern Alps appear to be highly resilient and have low sensitivity to climate change, there's a whole bunch of ecosystems and species within those landscapes, such as these alpine fens and bogs, and some of these critters like mountain pygmy possum and crockery frog, which are both have really low resilience. So all of these things are nationally listed threatened species and ecological communities. So they're already very close to change or extinction. But also some of these things, such as these alpine bogs, are also highly sensitive to very small changes in climate. So small hydrological changes in these systems will lead to large changes in how these ecosystems operate. So we need to really think about all of those levels, different levels of biological diversity when we're thinking about our adaptation strategies. But those frameworks that we've been talking about allow us to think about that sort of adaptation strategy at all those levels in a fairly comparable way. Final slide, just thank everyone that helped out with this broader national project, bringing together all these regional NRMs and CMAs and local land service regions, state governments, the ACT government, Commonwealth government provided the money. Was no mean feat, and this bit of work that I was presenting was part of a much broader project, so thanks to all those people. Thank you.
So have we got any questions for Dan while he's here? At the back?